I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Size Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark.
Hi, welcome to Arcane Mark. Today we're going to be doing a design diary on fantasy versus realism. So when I think about fantasy versus realism, I think about what kinds of assumptions from the real world do you want to have undergirding your setting, and what kinds of things do you want to have be handled in a way that uses magic or, high technology or other sorts of things that transform those assumptions. So, this could be something that's handled on a small scale of things like, on a day-to-day basis, when our characters move around, what are the types of magic or technology that they might interact with? It has to do with things like, for example, travel and transportation. How do they move around from place to place? How does trade work in that world? How are they able to get things from distant places, and what sorts of things are available? If you think about, there's also the use of fantasy tools as a means of abstraction as well, of certain things that you may not necessarily want to deal with. Like, I can certainly imagine having a thing where it's like, I don't want to deal with, needing to pick up arrows for my character and keep track of what my archer has. So I could handle that in a few different ways, right? I could say, all right, well, I'm just going to say, my archer buys enough arrows that they keep them stocked and they pick them up, and I don't really, then we don't bother keeping track of them otherwise, or maybe I have like a magic quiver that keeps me fully stocked. So like, the explanation doesn't necessarily have to be a fantastic one, but fantasy can be an easy way to get around some of those little tricky bits.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, when you're thinking about a setting from the baseline, the level of magic and technology are going to have a huge impact on the way that the culture that the PCs are in develops the fundamental assumptions of society. Like, if you have a society that, has invisibility magic and people can just be running around invisible, then that's going to make a big difference to, like, what does like security look like in that kind of place? Are people going to be worried about like invisible thieves breaking in? Or if you have a society with like divination magic, how do people guard their secrets? If you have a society where there is, powerful blasting magic, what does that mean for weaponry and battles in this world? And what does that mean for the kinds of challenges that there need to be out there for people to face? If you have a society that has, automatic cleaning magic, what does that mean for the kinds of industries? Do you have like magical, now I'm thinking of like an anime that we watched with like a magical laundry service that was done by magical slimes versus like, are people doing their own stuff? So what are the kinds of occupations, and what is the kind of division of labor that you have going on in your society? And are those fantastical elements something that are in the reach of most people? Like, is this a kind of setting where, a lot of people have a little bit of magic, or like everybody's got a superpower? Or is it a kind of setting where people who have those powers are extraordinary or exceptional in some way? And if they are extraordinary, exceptional, what does that mean for the way that people interact with them? Are people going to be in awe of them? Are they going to fear them? Are they going to try to use them for their own gain?
So I think before we can start delving into what we mean by fantasy and what level of fantasy and magic we want to have, it seems like fantasy would be the harder one to define here, but actually I feel that realism is the most important thing to define, because it is such a nebulous term that means a lot of things to a lot of different people. And before you can decide how your game setting or game system that you're designing is going to balance fantasy versus realism, you actually have to decide, what do you even mean by realism?
Yeah.
So, like, realism could mean that you are being very simulationist, and that you're going to try to make sure that everything that happens in the game world, like, makes perfect sense based on, like, the common sense, whatever that is for you and your group, or just you if you're the game designer, of how the world actually works. Or you could mean realism in terms of being gritty, or you could use realism in terms of being more naturalistic. So you will have to define your subgenre of fantasy in a way that also defines what your subgenre of realism is. So
Yeah.
are you gonna run something? You're gonna write something that's magical realism, that's mostly the real world, but with a few supernatural elements? Are you gonna do something that's fantasy slice of life that is super high fantasy but tries to simulate a lot of the expectations of the real world based on some assumptions of significantly high fantasy, but then extrapolating how would the real world be done? Or is the part that you're going to do that's not realistic that you're hand waving a lot of those details and are just going to make this about big heroes, super narrative? But maybe it doesn't have a lot of magic elements in it. It still could be something that abstracts away the realism, even if there aren't fireballs and it's just knights fighting with swords.
For example, hit points is a major abstraction. You know, the idea that, and you see like hit points the way they're used in a lot of games where it's like, oh yeah, you know, you're completely fine. You have 100 hit points and you're down to 1 and you're completely fine. Or like even if you are like, you know, injured down and there's like some kind of impediment, you're not generally seeing like you go into battle once and you're going to have some kind of injury that you're going to take with you for the rest of your life when you're severely wounded. That's not something that you really see in these kinds of games. And you think about.
I mean, it depends on the game. Depends on what the game prioritizes.
Yeah, but a lot of games that have combat as a central mechanic, you know, they're gonna have trouble if you don't have some way to recover from that and then get back and then.
Right.
And then be all right after those sorts of things, even if it takes a while.
And Rohit says that says here in the chat, I find the concept of realism difficult to understand. It seems that realism has more to do with the genre expectations than anything to do with logical world building. For instance, people who consider guns to be anachronistic for a setting, but not plate armor, even though plate armor is also often something that was developed later than some of the other technologies that people use in a pseudo-medieval setting.
Yeah, absolutely. Another one that I'm thinking about too is things about like how much are you as the world builder going to care about things like being very accurate with physics or like geography? Like are you going to, you know, because magic is sometimes used as an explanation for you're like, you know what? Like player A, I know that you're like a geologist by trade, and so you know that like this river technically wouldn't flow this way without this particular feature, but magic is the reason why things happen that way. It can, when a world has those sort of fantastical elements, it can also be used to sort of explain the things that you don't want to have to, because you don't want to build a world in as much detail as the real world, of course, and it helps to paper over some of those things.
Yeah, the question comes with how you're going to deal with questions. Like, for example, if I recall correctly, the Black Dragon's breath weapon like was specifically at some point said to be, I think, sulfuric acid.
Mm-hmm.
I think that may be correct. Or maybe it was said to be nitric acid. It was one of those like strong acids. And so someone had a chemist in their group who made a shield out of a type of metal that they had the material for. I want to say, like, I don't remember the chemistry of it. It was probably like silver or some other like thing that they could melt down coinage to make.
Mm-hmm.
And they were like, the chemical properties of this is that sulfuric acid is not gonna eat this metal. That's just not how they interact. And I'm just gonna make a big giant tower shield of that to block the way for where the dragon is. So like, do you want a character A to be able to, should that work?
Yeah.
B, how does the character even know that they should be doing that if their character doesn't have the appropriate like chemical or alchemical skills? Those are kinds of questions that you may ask yourself if you're deciding between fantasy and realism.
That's an excellent point too, is because the level of understanding and general knowledge in your setting, you know, it could be that something is true in the real world, but people in that setting don't know that, or they explain things as a different way, or they say, you know, maybe they just are in the habit of saying, oh, these things happen because magic, and there is actually a scientific explanation that's similar to our real world, but because magic is correct enough times that people don't really delve into that. And the sense of what is common knowledge may be very different in your world too. There may what do people know about society and history and culture?
Right. One of the risks you have when you're trying to make a world with both fantasy and realism and have them interact is that you might risk creating a system that is very high fantasy, but only if magic can be the explanation, and where some of the characters don't use magic and therefore get sort of hampered and unable to just participate in some of the adventures because it's like, well, yeah, we're going to make you do things that are only a real world Olympic athlete could do if you're a fighter. And if you're a spellcaster, you can do whatever you want because magic. So you need to think to yourself, what are the PCs and what are their opponents capable of doing? And then try to raise it so that all of the PCs are operating on that level of fantasy, that level of epic storytelling, if that's what you want, that level of gritty storytelling, if that's what you want, rather than at different and disparate levels.
Yeah, so if you want to have, and there's a mention, can technology be used to solve that problem? Absolutely. You could have a situation where it's like, some folks have magic and some people have power armor, or some people have other things that give them other jetpacks or other things that give them superpowers.
Yeah, as long as everybody is participating in the fiction in a way that is relatively at the level of fantasy versus realism that you want, you're not going to get that friction. And you will get friction if you have a group where half of the group is doing something that is at the level of Beowulf, who will just breathe underwater for swim across the entire ocean, punching to death hundreds of sea monsters while breathing underwater the entire time, while another person is playing and they have to be like Usain Bolt or a real world athlete, and it's very clear which of these two is going to be able to just do more in the fiction.
I'm trying to remember what I remember seeing a YouTube video a while ago that was there was a wizard and there was a biker. What was the deal with that?
You're talking about Angel Summoner versus Angel Summoner and BMX Bandit.
Angel Summoner and BMX Bandit. Yes, that's exactly.
It's we'll use our bikes to go in, and the Angel Summoner is okay, we'll do it without the angels, and then he starts going over this large gap, and it's just
he pedals and pedals, and he's like, yes,
I'm floating. He's like, wait a minute. It's did you have the angels just carry me over it? Yes, I did.
So don't do Angel Summoner versus BMX Bandit. The PCs and their meaningful opposition should have the same general level of resources. It's totally fine if that level of resources isn't available to every NPC in the world, as long as and you definitely have that in I'm thinking of World of Darkness, where it's oh yeah, well, not everybody is a vampire, mage, werewolf, changeling, etc., but you are, and your enemies are, but randos in the street aren't.
Right. And the BMX Bandit being the ally of the Angel Summoner there, you could do it, but if you did, you would want to make BMX biking somehow as fantastical in your setting as angel summoning is, which is a very challenging actual goal as a designer.
Yeah, so so I think that in that case you would probably have I'm imagining sort of Transformers style stuff where you are a giant mech who flies and has all these kinds of attacks.
Your BMX
and has a BMX
transforms into all these different things.
And you've got all these different kinds of guns. And,
drones come out of the bike, and each of which has various functions and can go out and scout for you and other things like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes, as opposed to just one dude with a bike and another who sends us a horde of celestial host of angels who just solve everything immediately. So, this is why the question of fantasy versus realism is so difficult to answer, because if you get 10 people in a room, they're not going to define realism the same way.
And how much
For some people, it's just their verisimilitude. It's like, this doesn't fit my verisimilitude, therefore it's not realistic. But really, nothing that you do really in an RPG is that realistic. It's always going to be abstracted. It's always going to go at its own pace. Unless you're literally playing that one game of Murder on the Throaty Mermaid that I was running, where I tried to abstract to the next day so that we could move on with the adventure, and people were like, no, we haven't questioned them for a full day in real life yet, so we should get more time to question them. And I was like, no, please, they just
don't do it in real time.
They won't listen to you anymore. We just have to keep going with the
adventure. Because of the limits of time, and frankly, like, you know, who wants to play a game based on living in real life? I mean, I guess you have like games like The Sims and stuff, but even they speed things up drastically and have other things like being able to instantly build houses and and weirdness. So like the things that make the game interesting to play are going to be inherently focusing on the things that are dramatic or interesting or like in some way entertaining or fulfilling, and not just the mundane drudgery of the day-to-day. Rowan has a question. What do you think of realism with respect to politics? A lot of fantasy is still limited to monarchy-like political systems. Is democracy seen as unrealistic?
I think it just depends on what setting that you want to emulate. I've definitely seen a lot of settings that have a more realistic, like, corrupt democracy that's more like a lot of governments in the real world, and those allow you to tell some very different stories than the ones that you tell if you're just like, this is the Holy Kingdom, and there's the evil empire to the north, and there's all these other different things that you would expect from like fantasy pastiche.
Yeah, I think generally, like, if you had fundamentally a society that has a beloved non-corrupt government that is doing a great job at managing all of the issues that face its citizens is less likely to be a society that needs heroes. So
that's true.
It's
also not very realistic.
Yes, it's also not very realistic. You know, every government's going to have its problems. But I think that you can have all sorts of interesting things. I would consider that it's probably more just because it's of the roots of fantasy and sort of like, we're, you know, fantasy going into like, yes, medieval tropes, etc., and then so you go back to, you know, a time when those political systems were more prevalent.
But you could do like a Greek fantasy from Athens and have like, you could have your democracies where the people decide to replace them with a tyrant because they're just like, we're sick of democracy. It's so messed up. Let's just have this tyrant take over again. It was better with the tyrant last time. And then overthrow it again for democracy all the time and like ostracize people. There's so many different political systems you can use just going through the real world with like realistic things that happened and tell a huge number of different stories.
Oh, and Sarko mentions it would probably suck big time to play a game where a character wasn't allowed to leave his birth village, as was the case in many places in late medieval Denmark.
That was true for serfs in a lot of places.
Yeah, you could certainly play a character who had those expectations on them, and then, you know, is coming from a background where the world beyond is something new and that they need to adapt to and is full of so much.
Mm-hmm.
You need realism to give magic purpose. The laws of physics that won't allow you to do what you want. Magic is all about overcoming those limitations. You can't tie a rope to an arrow and shoot. It won't work, but cast weightlessness on a rope? Yeah, like, because magic generally, you know, it should have some kind of internal logic and limitation to it so that you know what to grab onto. I see that sort of as like, you know, that it's easy, that restrictions breed creativity. You know, if you have a system that's just completely open and is like, oh yeah, you can do anything, then it's harder to grab onto than if you have a system that has more limitations. You know, this doesn't have to be things to the level of a game like Pathfinder or Starfinder where it's like, here's the description of literally exactly how the spell works. You can still have systems where you're building your magic spells out of ideas or components. But having a sense of, you know, what those components are, how strong they can be, what types of things you can act on in terms of, like, what kind of range can a spell? What kind of duration? What kind of targets? What sorts of things can it affect, and roughly how powerful can it be?
I think that's one of the beauties for people who like rules heavy systems, like I do a lot of the time. Like I like playing a lot of different kind of systems, but obviously I like rules heavy systems. I co-created Pathfinder 2, but one of the beauties of it is that it gives you the sense of shared expectations.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you don't do that, and a lot of things is sort of hand waved, you have to really, really know your group and get on the same wavelength and just agree, or else you're just gonna be arguing all the time over what's common sense for one person and not for somebody else.
Because as the GM, you need to have a sense of what sorts of things might be used to solve the challenges that you place before the player, so that you can produce interesting adventures. Like if you make something and then the player comes up with a strategy to cut through it like butter. Like, that can be hilarious if that happens once or twice, but if that's always happening and then you're having trouble coming up with interesting challenges, then that's a real issue. Another thing with that, too, is that once you've introduced that a particular tool is available in the world, the people who have access to that tool should also be using that tool. It shouldn't just be the PCs who have, unless there's a reason why, the PCs are the only one who have access to a certain power. Like, if everybody's got if a lot of people have teleportation, then teleportation should be linked into commerce and national security and all sorts of different things. You might have a thing
unless you're setting, you're just like, that's the kind of realism that you've decided you're setting, or your system just doesn't care about. Because realism really encompasses hundreds of different things, all of which can be called realism in some ways, and in some cases the idea of reactivity to components in the world, which I think is fundamental to having an interesting setting where you have narrative spells like that. I think that I would almost never want to run a game where you have narrative spells like that and then you just ignore that they exist, except for maybe when the PC uses it, and then it's like, oh my gosh, no one ever thought of that, even though we all have this spell. But you could, if the kind of game that you want to tell is just kind of, this is a beer and pretzels thing where we just go around and fight battles with these spells.
Yeah, although this is a design diary, though. This is not just a GM one, so I figured
but you might be designing that style of game that is just
Are there ones
that's cinematic and hand wavy, that everything is just the big cinematic thing we're doing right now because you're telling it like a movie rather than like a sort of a sprawling world.
But even a movie, if the PCs have access to this tool, and then their opponents, or the protagonists have access to this tool, and their opponents should have had access to this tool, and they didn't use it, then there should be some reason why they didn't use it. Otherwise, it's not satisfying.
I agree. That is both of our personal preference, but some people have a very different play style to that, and they tend to play very different styles of games. Is a valid play style. Do
you have some games that you've seen that you can recommend for folks who prefer?
I would say that generally, if that's what you're going for, you want more of a cinematic narrative system where you don't have a lot of underlying rules and decisions to make. So you can just come up with something out of the blue because you just declare some kind of teleportation, and then that's the first time teleportation was ever mentioned in the setting. There are no rules in the book that mention that it exists or not. You just said, I'm going to use a teleportation spell. You use it in that one scene. You never use it again later. It's never referenced again. And it doesn't have any implications for anybody else. And so, there are games that are like that. They work perfectly great for some groups. For other groups that want to dig deep into the setting implications, which Linda and I do all the time, then that doesn't always work as well for us. So let's see.
There's a
question here from Creative Burst says, I found the with nature of religion in games like that as unrealistic in the game world, as the classes that were linked to them don't really have a need for it. So even if int makes sense in our world, it had a disconnect in the fiction.
Oh, talking about skills that you're better at based on intelligence, but then but then like the classes that focus on those.
And we switched them over to wisdom.
Yeah, it's
Second edition.
I mean, I think part of it comes down to like the major abstraction that is boiling down like that is boiling down things into 6 ability scores. And
boiling down what might be decades of training of something into like 6 ability scores and a bunch of skills.
Yeah. And that's one thing that I think about with it actually just came up. We were having a conversation with this about our home group last weekend about like how in Pathfinder, you could be, you can have someone who trains at something for years and years and years, but then the person who like goes and fights monsters and doesn't really train or practices that thing gets better so much faster.
Oh yeah, it came up because of the fact that we were talking about the time. So in Linda's Adventures Council of Thieves, you may know that Elysial, my summoner, had a secondary persona before the Vigilante class was out, I guess, named Angel, who actually became a arena fighter without her Eidolon, weirdly enough, and then like a singer, and then the mayor of Westcrown. And she literally gained her singing abilities due to an intelligence headband that just gave her maximum ranks from no ranks. Because she had a Rod of Splendor. The Adventure Path dropped like 3 of them. And so she was invited to like the local Bard College to give like a speech to the graduates about like music and like how she got into music. And she just kind of like BS the thing about believing in yourself and following your heart, because her answer was just like, I went to the store and I bought a headband that gave me like 17 ranks or 15 ranks in performed singing, and then I went from having none to having like a plus like 30 or something in performed singing.
Yeah.
She was a little embarrassed by that, but she didn't let it show.
I see it coming from Dex Stargle. If you can cast high-level spells, you might be too busy pursuing important stuff like immortality or world domination to ferry around merchants. Absolutely, and that's totally a great explanation too.
Yeah, it just depends.
It just makes perfect sense within the setting.
Like, it depends on how hard it is to use teleportation. In some settings, magic like flying or teleportation are considered to be like some of the hardest things you could possibly do, and at the upper ends of magic. Whereas in a Pathfinder setting, they're kind of in the middle. Like, so therefore, it's not like nobody's gonna dominate the world right when they first got like dimension door teleportation. So you're gonna have to make that decision. I think it's perfectly reasonable to make a setting where teleportation is really, really high level. And if it wasn't for like the legacy of Dungeons and Dragons in Pathfinder and like keeping the Galarian setting where it was around the same level that it was in Pathfinder First Edition, that's a decision Pathfinder Second Edition could have made as well. It certainly allows you to tell travel stories more easily when teleportation is at that stage where it's like, yeah, sure, some people can do it, but at the level they're at, they're thinking on like a cosmic scale.
Another cool tool that the Second Edition has for that too is rituals, where it's sort of like they're a very easy way to set things up to say, here's a thing that the PCs can do under the right circumstances if they collect the right widgets, but that isn't going to be something that's constantly going on in all places all around the world. So it's a very easy tool to be like, hey, I need you to be able to do this one thing for the story, but I need to say that not everyone everywhere can do this.
Absolutely. Like, there are so many aspects and elements of realism that no matter how simulationist you want to say that you're being, there's always going to be 100 things that you still abstracted far beyond what like a real world would have. Like, for example,
you're not going to go into the amount of time that it takes your PCs to prepare all of their meals each day.
Yeah,
or
and
to,
what
like, set up their
the
bed,
exact
or, like,
ingredients of every meal that they made was, and also the changing supply and demand of various items, where it's like, Well, no, there's war with the Empire, so they made weapons and iron was short. So
Mhm.
when you found all that iron ore, the price would have been higher now.
Mhm.
But actually, you sold a bunch of it from the mine, so that put the price down here. But it hasn't spread yet to that other city over there. And
Mhm.
we've mapped out the trade routes and the amount of time that it takes to get there to determine how much you could buy and sell at each of
Mhm.
these places. Like,
Well, you know,
almost nobody is
while
going to
you were
actually do
sleeping in
that.
your tent last night, you got a bit of a crick in your neck, and therefore the next day you take a slight penalty. The next day you're clumsy one all day because you have a sore neck, and you know, or like you stepped on a rock.
I rolled
or,
for every different species of mosquito that's in the area to see if that kind of mosquito made it into your tent, so I can tell you which one it was.
yeah.
Now, the third of 27 species of mosquito actually recently was started carrying around a strand of a new disease that's been in the
So
region.
I'm gonna roll a D100, and if I roll a 1, then you have to roll a saving throw against that disease.
If you got hit by the third type of mosquito, then we're going to have to determine if you got that disease.
Yes.
If you did, you should know that those mosquitoes have also been around in regions where the elms actually have a rare elm disease. So that's going to raise the chances every time I describe an elm. I've been rolling a D100 to see if it has that elm disease. It's going to raise it from a 1% to a 3%.
Well, it also depends upon how much rainfall you've had recently and the topography of the nearby landscape.
Fortunately, we have
stagnant water.
We have a weather system that's based off of 100 years of real-world data from a European region that I've based this general area of the world on. And so, based on those trends, I created basically an AI system that will, based on what weather I said it was today, because sometimes I'll just declare it for the story purposes, it will predict the most likely next weather for like the next year. And I'll sometimes adjust some of them that I need to for the story, and it will readjust the weather.
And I'll use the fundamentals of the weather the fundamentals of the weather and the climate to determine the entire list of species that live here and how they interact. Help determine, what is the probability that if you decide to go rabbit hunting for 2 hours that you find a rabbit, and how many rabbits do you find on average when you do that?
Plus, every monster you kill, I have a program that calculates the ecological impact of that particular monster in its predator-prey chain. So if you keep killing the same monster enough times, it'll disrupt the chain and it will cause like migrations or other kind of shifts to throughout the area.
Now there can be an interesting disrupting predator-prey chain thing. There's one thing that happens in a little game that Mark was running for me, where I had my character going off and hunting just obnoxious amounts of the apex predator in a particular mountainous
Linda killed
area.
like every wyvern. She used like an unfair ability that only her character had to scout out every wyvern within miles, and then use travel magic to quickly move to the wyverns, and then metal chain magic to bind down the wyverns and then kill the wyverns. And at that point, then everything the wyverns were hunting was not being hunted.
Yes, but that I think was like, she was going around defeating the apex predator in the region in mass, and so like that made sense. That then there was a quest where it was like, oh, now the rocks and like the goats that eat everything and these
dire
other creatures,
mountain lions.
the dire mountain lions are all coming down into populated areas because you did that, and it's like, oops, okay, I guess you got to take care of that.
But it is what it is.
Yeah, well, you know what? She was high enough level. It was getting harder to find level appropriate enemies.
You know what? You do what you need to do, Linda.
Yep.
So I guess the point is, if you're not going into that level of detail, which pretty much nobody is, then there's always going to be abstraction. So the real point of this is, even if you think, no, mine's got high verisimilitude, I'm being very realistic, you're still making some compromises. You're deciding what kinds of realism, what kinds of verisimilitude are important to you, where you're going to spend your mental energy, your time at the table, and your player's attention. And that is a good thing as a designer and a GM to think about. And think about why you made that decision. Why was that important to you? Is it just because you get it kind of like sticks in your craw and grinds your gears when that is done wrong? Was it because you think that's an important aspect to like the feel and understanding of your setting and your game?
And that's also something that often evolves as his PCs get higher level, where the very lowest levels of play traditionally have more of dealing with problems that have more in common with the sorts of things that you might expect people to be able to solve without ridiculous tools. But the more powerful characters get, the more over the top the problems that they face are. And also the less interesting some of those more mundane problems get, because you've done things that are similar to them before, and those characters could solve them in their sleep. So
that's right. So these are the kinds of things you want to think about. You may have come into this episode being like, oh yeah, we can just pick fantasy or realism and then go somewhere on the spectrum and figure out, oh, high fantasy, then I'm over here. Oh, super realism, then I'm over here. Then just do that. But you can't just do that, because it's more than one dimensional question. It's an infinitely dimensional problem that has so many different solutions and decisions that you're going to be constantly making.
And a lot of that's going to have to do with, as a GM, what are the parts of that interest your players?
Absolutely.
Or if you're making a system, deciding which ones you want to emphasize and what the core engine is going to be. There's going to be some degree of things that you say, we're not dealing with this. You automatically succeed. This is fine. This is easy. Versus what do you decide to say, okay, this is a challenge. Maybe this is something that we handle in the abstract over a longer period of time. Like, say we're going to be, yes, you're traveling for a while, and make a roll or two to determine roughly how well your travel goes. Or you might go into things in a lot more detail. So what's nitty gritty, what's zoomed out, and what's just you do.
Exactly. So, yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say here on fantasy versus realism. It's a little more complicated than it seems, but it's still something that you really want to take into account and figure out why those parts of quote realism and quote fantasy matter to you. And again, you can have a setting that seems very mundane, but still is described in a way that's very fantastic. And you can have a setting that's super high fantasy, but also very slice of lifey, where you dig into the nitty gritty details of every fantastic effect, and you can do anything in between those.
All right, why don't we say goodbye to YouTube then?
Yeah, and then we can figure out our episode next time. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.
Bye.